It's my pleasure also to welcome you to the webinar. My name is Beverley Henry. As Lee said, I work with ACR in their partnership with the Global Research Alliance, and I'm a co-chair with the Integrative Research Group. The Integrative Research Group has as one of its networks the Soil Carbon Sequestration Network that's led by Denis Anger of Canada and Claire Chenu from France. So that gives some context for GRA. So the webinar will be presented in 3 parts. A brief overview of the background science of soil carbon sequestration and its application to offsets, some policy setting and Australia's soil carbon method development, and then the practicalities of actually implementing the soil carbon method. So firstly, just some science context, and I'll keep this fairly brief. For Australia, our soils are generally very old and weathered. As a result, they have poor structure, low fertility, and are low in organic matter and carbon. So since European settlement, historical land clearing and management practices not suited to Australian conditions have built on the natural physical and chemical soil constraints such as salinity, acidity, sedicity. And this has led to a decline in soil health and productivity across large areas. Along with high climate variability and especially severe droughts, unsuitable management has meant that the level of soil organic matter has decreased, with losses estimated to be as high as 20 to 70% in some areas. So what this means is that where soil organic matter has been lost, there is potential to build it for climate change benefits, for soil health and for production. And that's partly the driver for having this interest in soil carbon. But you have to know your baseline to understand the impacts of a practice change. So we've had quite extensive soil sampling across the countries. This map here represents about 5,500 sites synthesised from a couple of studies. And that's enabled a detailed mapping of carbon stock. Values range from around 5.9 tonnes per hectare in arid central Australia, but increase towards the coast in the north, the southwest and the east. And we've got up to 230 tonnes per hectare in some of the high temperate regions in southeastern Australia and in the cool wet regions of Western Tasmania. In general, there is a strong relationship between reliable water supply and soil organic matter. But importantly, variations occur even within high rainfall regions, and understanding the other factors that determine net productivity and influence soil organic matter inputs is important in understanding how we can influence soil carbon now. The soil organic carbon stocks, as most of you will be very familiar with, are influenced by the balance between carbon inputs and carbon losses. And the rate of inputs and the rate of losses are moderated by a number of natural and management factors. Inputs are generally determined by net primary productivity plus any added off-site organic matter. But soil losses is influenced by a whole range of factors. This isn't as simple as it may originally sound. This diagram came from some work by Professor Ratan Lal. And I won't go through all the factors, but you can see that it lists both soil factors and non-soil factors and a whole lot of individual characteristics and changes that actually influence what is going to be the final soil organic carbon stock and the change with any management activity. And what we want to do is tip the balance towards net gains in soil carbon. The problem is this can be difficult to predict, and it can be difficult to determine the change due to the management practice as opposed to natural factors. And that's why you need a whole lot of research to get the underpinning science, to have confidence in the underpinning science. Some of the research that has been done in Australia to enable us to count soil carbon, both in our national inventory and in the soil carbon method, it has been carried out since 2009, or in the period between 2009 and 2015, in two major programs. It builds on earlier work, and work has been ongoing. But I just wanted to emphasise these two programs to demonstrate the way the research has been organised to enable this method to be developed. So from 2009 to 2012, the Soil Carbon Research Program looked particularly at sampling and analysis issues across major agricultural land uses and soil types to get some standardisation. They aim to develop rapid, cost-effective assessment of total soil organic carbon, but also the fractions and soil bulk density that are needed to understand the change. Regional land uses and management to identify where higher soil organic carbon stocks or sequestration potential were, to target where to undertake management. And this data and understanding fed into both our national inventory through the full CAM model, a biophysical model with a soil component based on ROC, and also into the development of the method. The next tranche of research tried to identify the gaps and to fill those gaps from the first research, in particular to get a good understanding of the temporal change in carbon using in situ techniques. We've got very large areas of land managed for agriculture, particularly for extensive grazing, and soil sampling is both cost effective and time consuming. So using sensor techniques was of interest. We also identified areas for trying to understand the effects on soil carbon of particular management practices, crop and pasture management and change between these sorts of activities, vegetation management, looking at the effect on soil carbon of reforestation or plantation forest, and trying to quantify whether soil amendments, things such as compost, organics and biochar could usefully raise soil carbon, but also contribute to production in the agricultural commodities as well. And then we looked at modelling linking the measurement and modelling components to try to get at a lower cost method for implementation verification at a project scale. And this research was then linked to demonstration of practical on-farm applications. And there's a website on that slide if anyone wants more detail. But it's not just about the carbon. In parallel with the soil carbon programs, we had nitrous oxide programs. So the National Agricultural Nitrous Oxide Research Program looked at understanding better the carbon and nitrogen cycles and the dynamics, so that in activities to build soil carbon that resulted in an increase in nitrous oxide emissions, we were able then to quantify the net greenhouse gas benefits of the soil carbon activity. So with that science, what are some of the issues that were of particular interest? And anyone who's worked in this area will know that the spatial and temporal variability is a major challenge. The vulnerability to loss varies spatially, and it depends on the fractions of soil carbon, and that's why that was an area of research that was targeted fairly strongly. You don't have to quantify the fractions to know what your change in soil carbon is, but it helps you to understand where to undertake activities and what to expect. Soil carbon varies on a range of spatial scales, and understanding soil types and clay content is one of the important issues there. And soil carbon varies naturally on a range of time scales, and particularly with rainfall events and the variability in rainfall. So management can alter the rate and direction of change, but these natural factors can have an overriding effect as well. And we use that understanding then of the variability to look at how we develop monitoring, whether using cause and direct measurement, or new laboratory and in-field sensor techniques. So just very quickly, some of the issues in sampling. The requirements were, in the latest method that was developed in 2018, we're allowed to incorporate a degree of flexibility based on the research findings. And the method presents a decision tree type structure to show proponents how they might target the most cost-effective method. And I won't go into that detail, and I think one of the later presenters will also mention sampling. And the other major issue for determining soil carbon change is to make sure that the changes are calculated on equivalent soil mass basis. So bulk density has to be measured, and that was a major area of research to try to find a cost-effective way of measuring that as well. So just very briefly to finish up, the way the science is now helping to inform where projects might best be carried out. And proponents or prospective proponents to use the soil carbon methods are provided with information through the department's website of what to expect and where increases in soil organic carbon will be most likely or least likely. And I won't read all these factors, but you know, if native soil type has a high clay content, high soil fertility, high porosity, it's more likely to be able to hold carbon than a porous soil. So all of these factors, this information is given on all of these factors to help proponents make a decision. And once they've decided that they're interested, they can follow up with going into the policy in a way that will now be explained by Vyt and Konrad.
Thanks, Beverley. Run over a little bit. So I'll talk a little bit about the policy for soil carbon under the ERF. What I will do is cover briefly what the Emissions Reduction Fund is, or the ERF, the governance arrangements under the ERF, what a method is, and how it works, important factors in regards to setting up a method, which are the offsets integrity standards, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail about what the methods are under the ERF for soils. So the Emissions Reduction Fund, it was established in 2014, building on the Carbon Credits Carbon Farming Initiative of 2011. It introduced three components. It introduced a crediting component, which was under the CFI Act, or the Carbon Farming Initiative Act. Purchasing, which was a $2.55 billion fund, which would enable the government to purchase Australian carbon credits. And a safeguard mechanism, which was to prevent increasing emissions for high emitters. So briefly explaining how projects and crediting works under the ERF. What a project proponent needs to do is look through methods and find activities. I'll explain what a method is later. What they do then is they register the project with a clean energy regulator. There are certain ticks and boxes that you need to go through in order to be registered. That will be covered off more in the practicality aspect that Konrad will speak to later. You then start your project and report on emissions reductions to receive your carbon credits. Carbon credits are property rights and they are administered by the regulator. Then if you wish, you can sell the credits. This is where the ERF comes into it. The proponent can participate in reverse auctions with the government and become contracted to sell an amount bid as it becomes available. Minimum bids to participate in these reverse auctions are 2,000 tonnes. Contracts with the government normally run between 7 and 10 years. Another alternative is to sell the carbon credits earned on the secondary market or the voluntary market. For example, the Australian government is running a scheme for carbon neutral certification called the National Carbon Offset Standard. That allows organisations or companies, events, products to determine a carbon boundary, determine what that carbon amount is that needs to be offset within that boundary, and they can purchase those carbon credits. The ERF governance arrangements can be divided into 4 primary areas. The Department of the Environment, which I am of, is responsible for policy development and development of new methods for projects to be run. The Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee, or ERAC as we call them, is an independent expert committee which assesses whether methods meet requirements of the Emissions Reduction Fund and provide advice to our Minister for the Environment and Energy. The committee assesses the integrity of the methods to ensure that all methods comply with the offset's integrity standards. These standards help ensure abatement is delivered under the method is genuine and additional. They provide other advice to the Minister on methods as well. The Minister sets priorities for emission reduction activities. That means which methods we will develop. And he also, or she, also approves methods and makes safeguard rules. The Clean Energy Regulator is responsible for the key administrative tasks, including registering projects, running auctions, managing contracts, and issuing Australian carbon credit units. Currently, the ERF is for all sectors across the economy. At the moment, we have 781 projects registered, and that's, as seen on your screen, is the proportion in different sectors. Agriculture has 62 projects, and within agriculture, 44 projects are registered for soil carbon methods. Just to give you a little bit more background of how the ERF fits together and the methods fit together, is that there's effectively 3 layers of rules. We have the UNFCCC accounting rules, which also rely on the IPCC guidelines. We have our Australian National Inventory reporting, and they tie into land project methodologies, and indeed all our methodologies. It's really important that they all tie together so that they all become eligible, so that projects are eligible for abatement under Australia's national greenhouse gas contributions, or nationally determined contributions. So what is a method? A method is a legislative instrument that is made by our minister. As I've said, the methods must comply with the offset's integrity standards, and this ensures that those reductions do contribute towards our targets. Methods do and will evolve over time. New determinations or legislation can come out to enhance methods as new science comes out. As I've mentioned several times before, the offset's integrity standards are a key component of methods. Just to briefly go over those, we have the additionality requirement. It means that the project or the activity is not business as usual. For farmers, business as usual can be quite diverse. Some businesses will consider some activities normal, and some farmers will consider activities foreign. It needs to be able to be measured and verified. We need to be able to make sure that the abatement is occurring. As I've said, it needs to be eligible. It needs to be able to contribute to our targets. It needs to be supported by evidence, and that means that we need to ensure the activity is actually creating the abatement. We need to make sure the material emissions are excluded from any abatement. That means any extra fuel used or emissions created, for example, by improving pastures through increased stocking rates, is deducted. We also need to make sure that estimates are conservative. It's the government's position to always be on the conservative side and not to overestimate. We need to maintain carbon in the landscape for a determined permanence period, which can be 25 or 100 years. That is a long time after our crediting periods finish. Proponents earn carbon credits for up to 25 years. So potentially an activity will require to be conducted for another 75 years after crediting is finished. It's important to mention that carbon credits may be relinquished, but it's not normally needed in agricultural sections. It will only be needed where there's false or misleading information or project areas have changed. You won't need to do it where it's been carbon losses through natural disturbance and proponents have taken reasonable actions to reduce risks such as bushfire. If a methodology is found not to be consistent with the offset's integrity standards, it can be suspended for up to 12 months so that new projects will not be registered. The Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee will also do periodic reviews of methods to ensure they remain consistent with the offset's integrity standards. So our first soil carbon method was the 2014 measured soil carbon. It focused on grazing and pastures. It has been revoked. It was revoked in 2019. In this method, sampling design was really important. It required obtaining a baseline and making sure that baseline sampling was right and valid, so that later on it was allowed for changes. The sampling required a certain number of samples to be able to meet minimal detectable changes. Where there were fewer samples, it meant that only larger changes were able to be detected. It required a minimum of 3 strata in the project area with 3 samples in each strata. That's 9 samples for the most simple of projects. It did not allow for any restratification of the projects. It did not allow for the application of biochar or coal. As I've mentioned before, there is an opportunity to have a 25 or 100-year permanence period for a project. In sequestration projects, a 25-year period will be subject to a 20% discount of credits received. This is to reflect the potential cost to government of replacing carbon stores if the projects are discontinued after 25 years. Sequestration methods also have a 5% risk of reversal buffer. This means that for every 100 tonnes of carbon stored, only 95 Australian carbon credits units are issued. This buffer means that a project proponent does not have to replace credits if carbon stores are lost due to natural events such as bushfire. Our second soil method was a 2015 model soil method. It used modelled estimates of carbon sequestration, or as we call it, default values. It can be used for sustainable intensification, stubble retention, or conversion to pasture. Sustainable intensification involved undertaking two or more of the following management activities, which is either nutrient management, soil acidity management, new irrigation, or pasture renovation. Stubble retention is self-explanatory, and conversion to pasture is also clear. The model method avoids the need for direct measurement and the complexities of sampling design and users' default values. The model method has no projects registered, as participants perceive it is too conservative in calculating abatement. The conservative elements of this method reflect the legislative requirement for methods to be conservative in calculating abatement. You can see some sample numbers on your screen now. The 2015 method challenge was about how do we improve the numbers. To improve abatement numbers and to make the method more appealing, we would need more data. With more data, we can increase the certainty of the models and then can be less conservative. Industry and government can play a role in this. Ideally, systems are set up to capture the sampling and to ensure sampling results can be used. But this is expensive, especially in obtaining longitudinal data so that climate models are useful and incorporated. Developing models of real numbers is time consuming and costly, and someone does need to pay. It's still a work in progress in a number of circles. Our latest method, the 2018 soil method, and I just thought I'd quickly go through the development process for that method. We looked at addressing some of the shortcomings of the two methods, and I engaged a technical working group to identify key issues to resolve. The technical working group included relevant industry bodies, scientists, and soil carbon project proponents, as long as with the department. We conducted public consultation over 28 days and received 17 responses. We also held 2 workshops with key stakeholders in industry, academia, and government. We performed a technical assessment to ensure the calculations are representative scientific calculations in the method and that they meet the relevant offset integrity standards. The Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee provided advice to the Minister on their assessment and if the method met the offset integrity standards. And then the Minister finally signed off the legislative determination. The reason I wanted to go through that process is that, as you can see, I've really skipped over it, but it is quite a long process and involved many, many iterations of the technical documents and the science. The 2018 method is effectively replacing the 2014 method with a number of changes. The new method allows for farmers to participate by changing the ways they manage their cropping, grazing and horticultural systems. It also provided a contemporary soil sampling strategy and a new measurement approach, such as sensors technology, to improve accuracy and to reduce costs of measurements. The use of sensor technology was made possible by the Australian government investment in its development. The carbon pool it covers soil organic carbon, livestock, synthetic fertiliser, lime, tillage events, landscape modification, residues and irrigation energy. What I'll quickly cover is the increased prescribed project activities, which you can see on the screen, a land management strategy requirement, and increased measurement flexibility. So as I said, you can see the activities on your screen. That's from the legislation. It also allows for application of biochar, though still excludes coal. Compost can be applied, but requires sampling not to occur within 2 years of application. The land management strategy is a requirement to have a document which is prepared and signed off by an independent person. It covers off the activities through to the end of the carbon permanence period, which may be up to 100 years. Documents take into account the limitations of increasing soil activities and soil carbon stocks through activities. The land management strategy needs to be reviewed every 5 or 10 years after crediting by an independent person. Under the ERF, this is important because it provides the farmers a mechanism to establish expectations of sequestration and also in the case of reversals, provide a safety net documenting reasonable management actions. It can also introduce flexible management, for example, managing pasture to crops and back. There are also activities which are restricted under the method, so it's good to have them documented in the land management strategy. The 2018 method challenge was, how do we measure real increases in soil carbon over time as a result of management changes? We achieved this through conservative regression and early reporting discounts. The baseline needed to be determined first, which was determined from 10 years preceding the project. That gave an effective number to work from. The department also applied 3 controls to manage this, applying a 60% probability of exceedance to measured change in carbon stocks, subtracting the variance from the mean, and using the 10th percentile to calculate equivalent soil mass. Now, I'm not going to get into detail about what they all mean, but they are all managing probabilities and taking conservative values when doing measurements. Another important feature is that the regression line that's produced through the 60% probability of exceedance is recalculated after each sampling round to ensure a trend line will more accurately describe the average soil carbon stock exchange over time due to those management actions. I mentioned the early reporting discount, which is a 50% temporary discount applied to the first measurement. A trend will need more than 2 measurements, and so once you have three dots, you start getting a trend. I think I've mentioned, but crediting for projects are up to 25 years, but there is a provision in our legislation to extend beyond that period. I'll hand over to Konrad now.
Hello all. So I'm Konrad Muller from the Clean Energy Regulator. So we are the agency that administers the scheme. It is with us that you register your project, apply for credits. We also manage the fund that purchases credits from contractors, and we administer the register under which units can be transferred as Australian carbon credit units. So Vyt briefly sort of touched on that there's a 2.55 billion fund. There is about 226 million remaining from that, which hasn't been committed to contracts already. We're holding the next auction next month, and so a bit more of that money will be committed then. An additional 2 billion has also been allocated from the 2020 financial year under the Climate Solutions Fund, so that'll be an ongoing source of demand there. There is also an offset market for Australian carbon credit units. So that amounts to, well, at least in 2017-18 was around 150,000 ACCUs, and there's also a voluntary market for offsetting under the National Carbon Offset Scheme, and state government demand up until March 2019, that amounted to about 800,000 ACCUs. So showing on the screen at the moment is where the soil carbon projects are under the ERF. Most of them are on the former method, which Vyt mentioned. This is the sequestering soils and grazing systems method. Due to the time when they were registered, any new projects coming in will need to come in under the measurement of soil carbon sequestration agricultural systems method, and we have 1 project registered under that to date. So these projects occur in a range of rainfall zones, so around 300 millimetres of annual rainfall to a metre of annual rainfall, so it's quite a diverse number of systems where these projects are. I'll go a bit more into what kind of activities they're doing in order to build soil carbon later on in the presentation. So just to sort of expand upon how you undertake a soil carbon project in order to earn carbon credits. So the first step is to register your project with us, and I'll go into a bit more of the sort of conditions under which you would do that a bit later on. You can also add a new farm to an existing project. You'll then need to define the carbon estimation areas where you're undertaking your project activity and aiming to earn the carbon credits for, and you'll also need to account, there's also emissions accounting areas where you're doing, which are affected by your project activity, but for which you're not sampling in order to gain carbon credits. So in your first reporting period, you're going to need to sample to estimate your baseline carbon stocks. And that's sort of the baseline from which you'll be credited further on in the project. You then undertake your project activity, and as Vyt sort of went through, at least some of the activities you can do. You can also do activities on top of those. You'll then need to sample to gain an estimate of the change in soil carbon. So you'll need to do that at least once every 5 years or more often, noting that if you sample frequently at the start of your project, you'll also be required to sample frequently later in your project, because we want a sort of even range of sampling over the course of the project. And this will give us an estimate of soil carbon change over time. In Vyt's presentation, there was an example of what that regression looks like. If you report to us after only taking 2 sampling rounds, there is a discount, which was also mentioned there. So after you do three sample rounds, a baseline and 2 subsequent, that's when you're on the sort of normal crediting trajectory. So you report those results to us. So you undertake the protocols under the method in order to extract those samples, and we'll talk a bit more about that later as well. You then attach an audit report to that offset report, which gives a reasonable assurance audit on that report. And if there's an increase in soil carbon, you can then claim Australian carbon credit units for those increases in soil carbon, noting that there are discounts within the method for uncertainty or variability, and also the risk of reversal discount, which amounts to 5% of your net abatement amount. And if you are a 25-year permanence period project, there is also a 20% discount for that as well. You then can hold those ACCUs or sell them to the regulator under a contract if you have one with us. And there's also that secondary market, which I referred to at the beginning of the presentation. So just to talk about, judging by that previous slide, there are a lot of steps to participating in the scheme. You don't need to do this all by yourself. There are aggregators, and we provide for this under the scheme, where multiple landholders can give consent for a single participant to register all their soil carbon projects under the same method. All their soil carbon areas under a single project, under a single method. And then you only need to provide a single offset report and a single audit report for that grouped area. There is also contract aggregation. This is where multiple projects, potentially under multiple methods, are grouped under a single contract. These are, a single party then has commercial arrangements with multiple projects in order to provide credits to meet their contract volumes and delivery schedules. So there's a bit of a diagram there around how that works. So essentially, the participant does not need to own the sites, but they need to have the consent in order to earn the carbon credit units from those activities. You'll need to measure at least once every 5 years for the 25-year crediting period under the agricultural systems method. The soil carbon stocks must be estimated using stratified random sampling, and samples must be measured for soil carbon content using particular laboratory techniques or calibrated in-field sensors. Vyt went through what that sort of trend line looks like in terms of how increases over time are credited. You'll also need to account for project emissions from any increases in your emissions due to increased numbers of livestock, fertilizer addition or lime or dolomite addition. And these are the changes above baseline. So these are deducted from crediting, but only the difference between what you did in your baseline period and what's occurring as a result of your project. If you applied biochar, you'll need to deduct the amount of carbon or an estimate of the amount of carbon that was in that biochar. So essentially, you're credited for any gains in soil carbon that occur as a result of that biochar, but not from the carbon that's in the biochar itself. Any organic fertilizers you use must be from designated waste streams like intensive animal production or municipal waste. There's a few other sources. You can also develop them from products within your CEAs, but what you're not able to do is to take carbon from areas outside of your CEAs and put them in your CEAs and be credited for that carbon, which is just being sort of shifted around. So to talk a bit more about what the sampling design might look like, there's a couple of options under the new method. So you can do equal area stratification, where your carbon estimation areas are divided up into at least 3 equal areas. You then take one core out of each of these strata. One core out of each of those strata, combine them together, and you'll need to take at least 3 cores. So you end up with 3 composite samples at the end for each CEA. One of the features of the new method is that you don't necessarily need to divide your carbon estimation areas up into equal areas. You can use unequal area stratification, which allows you to target your sampling if you know prior information about your field and where the carbon levels are, and that allows you to reduce the variability that you get in your sampling, and reduced variability can result in sort of more credits due to the precision there. You can also change those boundaries between around the strata between sampling rounds as you know more about the field as the project progresses. Again, this method allows you to do activities under pasture, crops, horticultural and mixed farming systems. We'll assess that you're doing a new activity or a materially different activity compared to what you're doing under your 10-year baseline period. This is typically demonstrated in a land management strategy, which needs to be signed off by an independent person with certain competencies, like they are agronomists, etc. These new activities must not be required, or materially different activities must not be required by law. That is, if under your state regulations you're required to control a certain weed, or there's a conservation covenant on the area which, say, prevents you doing certain cultivation practices, for example, you can't use those activities or the cessation of those activities as your project activity in order to demonstrate newness for additionality. And it's also worth mentioning that projects are entitled to use the method until the end of their crediting period. So, as Vyt mentioned, a lot of the projects are signed up under the former grazing systems soil carbon method, and those projects can can stay on that method for the duration of their crediting period, and that gives them certainty around how they do their calculations and permitted activities, etc. Just in terms of the method in practice, we issued the first soil carbon credits this year. It was 406 Australian carbon credit units for a project in Victoria. They used the Soil Key pasture renovator as their sort of new or materially different activity, introducing a mulcher behind that. This is a machine that does a one-pass cultivation, does mulching, aeration, and applies mixed species seeding. So that was their activity. We're looking at our project register. Most projects sort of cite the rejuvenation of pastures and changing grazing patterns as their project activity. Others include other activities, cover cropping, addition of fertilizers, and changing tillage practices. So, for example, moving to intensive tillage to minimum tillage. Just in terms of the idea of the scheme is that you can register a project, and you don't necessarily need to sample straight away. You can nominate to have a delayed crediting period, and after doing your baseline sampling round, you can wait a number of years before doing your subsequent sampling round, which means that we might not have results for projects might not report for up to 7 years after registration. So we'll know more about projects as more and more report. Vyt also went through that soil carbon needs to be maintained for a set period, and there are discounts if you nominate to only maintain that for 25 years. That's a 20% discount. So in terms of the projects which we have registered to date, only 3 of 44 projects are 100-year permanence projects, and the remainder have elected to be 25-year permanence projects. You also need to note when registering a project that particularly because of those permanence obligations, consent is required from those with an interest in the land, such as banks which might hold a mortgage on the land, etc. And particularly where the participant is different from the landholder, they obviously need to have both legal right and consent related to permanence on those. And just to sort of quickly take you through what audit might mean. So once you've followed the protocols under the method and put together an offset report, that will need to be independently audited. You'll need to undertake these audits at least 3 times over the course of a project, and it is at the participant's expense. The regulator might also commission audits if certain criteria are met. Those are generally at the regulator's expense. Our auditors are registered under the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme, and they establish reasonable assurance that the calculation of carbon abatement reported by the project is accurate. That involves going through all the necessary documents and information, and potentially field visits to verify that those calculations are accurate. If you're looking for further information on the scheme, our website address is up on the screen, and we also have an email address there which you can contact us on, and as well as further details or contact details are on our website. So, thanks very much for your time.
So we're going to now turn to questions. We've had quite a number of questions come in through Q&A, and we'll do our best to get through as many as we can. If we don't get through them all, or if there's more detail required to fully answer the question, we're happy to take that offline. So the first question that came in was, when using animal waste imported to the farm or legume rotations to build soil carbon and nutrients, what are the key practices needed to prevent carbon emissions and nitrogen runoff? So bringing in animal waste from an eligible livestock system, an intensive livestock system, is an eligible activity and can be used to promote soil organic matter input to the soils and therefore build soil carbon. And legume rotations is also an eligible activity and one that can be highly beneficial because many of our soils in Australia are low in nitrogen, and this saves using chemical fertiliser. So the net benefits in terms of soil carbon is the inputs less the losses, and the losses may be higher immediately after importing more organic material and more nitrogen because of the increased turnover. But at the same time, you'll have you'll build soil health and productivity. So that has to be taken into account as well. So to emphasise the benefits for soil carbon sequestration will be the net increase in soil carbon over a period of monitoring, and deducted from that will be any increase in nitrous oxide emissions. In terms of practices needed to prevent carbon emissions and nitrogen runoff, it's difficult to say in advance. If you manage the land well with good plant growth and no lay periods, you're less likely to get losses. And if there is nitrogen runoff, I don't know whether we've mentioned this throughout the presentation, but as well as looking at greenhouse gas emissions directly, the method also takes into account whether there are environmental impacts that are going to be negative, and that's taken into account in the auditing of the project. So without going into specifics, it is taken into account. So I hope that answers that question.
Well, so I've got a number of questions which were asked around the around stratified random sampling. So it is random sampling within a strata, and there was a question about how are strata defined. So if you're doing equal areas, as long as your areas are within 5% of each other, you can allocate them how you want within that CEA, noting that all the areas within that need to be eligible areas, that meet all the requirements of the method. If you're doing unequal area strata, you have a lot of discretion around how you draw those areas. You might use information from proximal sensing or satellite data in order to draw those strata and target your sampling and improve the efficiency of your sampling. There is also a question about what is a typical area farm would include as a project for a carbon estimation area. So unfortunately, all that's sort of available publicly, so some information under our scheme is protected, and but you can see sort of the project areas for registered soil carbon projects on our project map. We don't really know from that what the carbon estimation areas are, and we don't really, as I mentioned before, there's one project that's reported, so we don't really have a lot of information around what's typical at this stage. Sorry, I'll let Beverley answer a few more.
So we have a question here that relates to the use of sensor technologies. It says, can you shed some light on the possibility of using the low-cost option of handheld NMR, MIR soil carbon measurements? And some of this work has been under development by CSIRO in Australia. And so using them for demonstrating carbon sequestration. So under the method that was determined last year in 2018, it is permitted to use sensor technologies. there are some very strict requirements that are set out in the method itself for how sensor technologies are used, the sort of instruments to use, the way they have to be calibrated, and they do have to be calibrated using dry combustion for the site, and but there is the possibility of using them. And the reason that was introduced was to allow a lower cost option where the capability of using that instrument existed. So I can provide more detail offline if you like, but the requirements are all set out. Not only the requirements, but recommendations as well are set out in the method explanatory statement and in the supplement to it. And I might just answer this related question while I have the floor. This question says, I understand that a spectral model should be developed for each site using visible near-infrared to measure soil carbon. Is there a soil spectral data library somewhere which landholders can use to supplement the model training data collected on their own property? And their answer is yes, there is a global spectral library. The recommendation in the method is that the instrument be used and calibrated according to the manufacturer's recommendations and the accessories that are recommended to go with that. But there are recommendations as well, and one of them is to access these spectral data libraries. And there's a reference to them in the supplement for the method that's available on the web. So we're trying to make that accessible, even though it's quite complex to use, and a farm owner would probably not use it on his own, but would have to get expert technical help.
Again, so a couple of other questions for me. Sorry, there's a light loss. There was a question about, is there a method for sugarcane? And I'm not aware of barriers under the measurement of soil carbon sequestration in agricultural systems method that would prevent you from registering a project under that. However, you need to go through and see whether your activities meet the requirements under the method. So definitely have a look at our website or the Federal Register of Legislation and see whether whether the particular activity you're planning under the sugarcane system would be eligible. Particularly note there are particular restrictions for acid sulfate soils that might apply there. There was another question regarding, is there training provided to the independent person that drafts or reviews the land management strategies? So these are the strategies which are submitted at registration, which address what the project's going to do over the course of its accrediting and permanence period in order to build soil carbon. No, we don't provide training. They need to have certain competencies which are listed there in the method and the supplementary material attached to that. And these are submitted when you apply to register the project, which isn't necessarily at the same time as when they are contracted, just to get to the latter part of that question.
Okay, I think we're getting close to time now, Lee.
If we've got more questions to answer, we'll probably go slightly longer.
There was a question briefly there about providing an update on safeguard mechanisms and its relevance to soil carbon participants to provide ACCUs to heavy emitters. So under the safeguard mechanism, there's a requirement for those emitters to obtain ACCUs to offset those emissions that exceed their safeguards. So soil carbon is one of the methods. As I showed in a slide a while back, the ERF covers all the sectors. Currently, forestry is one of the leading sectors in being able to produce ACCUs, but they do cover all sectors of the economy. So the relevance there is that soil carbon can provide and may provide a number of ACCUs to those companies breaching their safeguard limits, and also in the voluntary market.
Hi again. There was also a question about the usual cost of sampling per hectare for a grazing project. Again, that's probably something where you'd want to talk to a service provider about their costs. We don't provide any specific guidance on that. And related to that, there was a question about how many samples are needed in order to do a sample. In order to do one sampling round. The minimum, so you're going to need a minimum of 3 strata within a carbon estimation area, and you're going to need to take 3 samples from within those strata. Those strata are not capped in size, noting that the more variable the areas within your strata, the greater the discounts that will apply. So hopefully that helps there.
Okay. So Lee, is there?
I'm just trying to go back on video here. Okay, thank you very much. That's all the time we have for now. That was Australian Soil Carbon Offset Methods, the science, the policy and the practice. I'd just like to thank Beverley Henry, Vyt and Konrad Muller for being our presenters and taking your questions. I think we covered almost all of the questions. There were a couple of long ones there that we're happy to take offline. And of course, if anything comes to mind later on, please, we're happy to have a look at them.